Welcome to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also known as CBAM. It's the webinar on the aluminium sector, as you see on the slide. This event is organized by the Director General Taxation and Customs Union, also known as DG Taxud, of the European Commission. My name is Camilla Sørensen, and I have been a part of the CBAM team since the proposal. For today, I will be the moderator. My colleagues, Maxime Monlion, Ivica Olovic, and Thomas Brinkman will guide you through this webinar. We would like to thank you for being here. This is the second webinar out of 6 sector-specific webinars. These webinars will introduce the rules and requirements for the transitional period for importers and producers of aluminium, as well as any other stakeholder interested in the CBAM of the EU or from non-EU countries. 4 other webinars will be dedicated to fertilizers, electricity, hydrogen, and iron and steel. The webinar on cement was completed last week. I'm also happy to choose and how to use the CBAM transitional registry will also be provided. First, I would like to inform you about the registration in Zoom. Please make sure that you appear in Zoom with your name and affiliation. If needed, please rename yourself by the following steps as shown on the screen. Now, many participants are attending this meeting, so I would like to go over the housekeeping rules for this webinar. All participants are muted during the presentation, and please note that this is recorded and that you're not allowed to record it yourself. You may at any time write questions in the chat, and the chat is available for all participants, and questions will be answered at the end of this webinar. For this webinar, we invite you to focus on the questions for the aluminium sector and for questions related to the transitional period, not other aspects of CBAM that is not covered by this webinar. Lastly, please note that during this webinar, presentations and answers to questions are meant to help you prepare for CBAM. In no circumstances can the answers be interpreted as definitive views expressed by the European Commission, or nor are they legally binding. Now that I have made a little introduction and had set the rules for this webinar, I would like to invite you to give us a poll on where you're coming from us to be able to navigate through this webinar. So please, within the next 20 seconds, tell us which entity defines you the best. Yes. So I hope that the results are shown on the screen, and I can see that, lucky for us, many different participants from different entities has joined this webinar. Again, we are very thankful for you that you're participating in today's webinar. Now, let's set the agenda. For this webinar, the objective is to introduce the rules and requirements for the transitional period. We will look into the specific case of aluminium, and then we will briefly look into the CBAM transitional registry and the timeline for submitting the CBAM reports. Now, I think we should move on to some of the more fun part of this webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our director, Maria Elena Scopio. She is the Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration at DG Taxud. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot to everyone for being here today at this webinar. I would like, first of all, to start by apologizing for the background noise. I am currently in the formal high-level working party in Madrid, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to address you all and to welcome you to this dedicated webinar, which has been done just for you. I would also like to say that if there are some technical issues, it's unfortunately normal. This is very, very much populated as a meeting. Zoom is a bit complicated to use, but that was the only chance we could have in order to allow you all to participate. So I would just like to thank again my colleagues that are doing their utmost to ensure that you all can participate in the best conditions, and to request for some bit of patience from you. Coming now to our introduction, I would just like to remind to everybody how CBAM is a super important part. It is a cornerstone for the Commission on which we have built all our climate policy. It was first proposed as announced, in fact, in 2019. It was part of the European Green Deal, then part of the Fit for 55 climate package, and finally proposed in 2021. This is an incredible opportunity to allow us to reach the target of reducing of at least 55% emissions by 2030 and to reach climate neutrality by 2050. We really believe in this initiative, and we don't consider that this has any punitive effect. We have to put ourselves in some perspective. We are confronted with unprecedented crisis of environmental nature, and we are all aware of that. There is a triple crisis, which is a crisis on climate change, biodiversity loss, and also pollution. We really cannot wait. That's why we are trying to be front runners, not only for what concerns the engagements that have been put on our producers, but also to try to put, in fact, on the same level playing field, the goods that are also entering our borders. This has a double effect. First of all, we ensure that there is no disequality of treatment in terms of goods that are imported in Europe. And also we have an indirect way of supporting greening of policies in non-EU countries, in countries that are outside the European Union. As I said, it's not a question of if, but it's a question of how and when. And the double objective I've indicated needs to be combined with a way of achieving our internal commitments and minimizing the impact on trade. Now, CBAM is one of the tools that we have in order to do so. Therefore, we are here to try to implement it in the best way possible, and to encourage fair price on carbon anywhere. The carbon emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods in particular needs to be considered and needs to be taken into account as much as it is done for the European producers. To do so, we have chosen the way of the dialogue with the stakeholders, the dialogue with the partner countries, and the dialogue with the importers, which are the most important category impacted, we understand, because there is a number of obligations that are put on them and that we are here to explain. As you know, it will only start on the 1st of October. My colleagues will dwell on it, and it will only be theoretical, if you want. So there will be no payment at the border yet for some time. But it's still important that all the obligations are understood and that everything is done so that who is supposed to be putting it in place can do it easily. So you have seen today we have this webinar, but there are other ways in which we're trying to dialogue with the public authorities, businesses, federations, medias, NGOs, you name it. We have written guidance, online trainings. This webinar is one of them. E-learning courses. There is a dedicated webpage which will be constantly updated, and the content will be translated in the most spoken languages in the world. Finally, let me just say that it's not only an issue that has to do with the countries that are the main exporters to the EU. We don't want to leave anyone behind. So for the least developed countries, we really hope that their production, if possible, will go upward, and that they will also be able to receive all kinds of support they will have to implement our CBAM. In this respect, let me just say that the EU is one of the greatest contributors to the climate financing worldwide. With this, I would just like to stop this introduction in order to leave you in the very capable hands of my colleagues that will guide you through these webinars. But we remain at your disposal to help you in case you need additional questions in the limits of our capacities. Again, I apologize for this noise. It was really important for me to be able to be here with you today nonetheless. Thank you very much and have a great webinar.
Now, I am happy to give the floor to Maxime, who will present to us the general aspects of CBAM, starting from the main target of the CBAM initiative. Maxime, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilla. The primary objective of the CBAM is to prevent the carbon leakage, while free allocations are gradually phased out under the EU emission trading system, the EU ETS, which is the EU's carbon pricing scheme applying on EU producers. Carbon leakage is a risk which occurs when companies based in the EU move carbon-intensive production abroad to countries where the climate policies in place are less stringent than the EU, or when EU products are being replaced by importations of goods with more carbon-intensive content. This is how the CBAM complements the EU ETS. It puts a carbon price on importations of certain goods that are produced in non-European countries and imported into the EU. And this carbon price will be calculated so that it is equivalent to the one that would have been paid if the producer of the good had been located in the EU, and hence subject to the EU carbon pricing scheme. Another important objective of the CBAM is to encourage non-EU countries and their producers to decarbonize their production processes. And by doing so, the CBAM charge to be applied on the goods that they export to the EU will be lowered. Then let's move to the reporting obligations during the transitional phase. As a first word on the CBAM itself, it was adopted by the EU and officially entered into force in May 23 this year. The CBAM regulation of the 2017 of implementing regulation of the 2017 of August will start applying as from the 1st of October with a transitional period. All the webinar sessions that we are organizing will focus on the transitional phase. As a result, during the presentations, we will touch upon the definitive period as from 2026, here and there where it is relevant, but we will not discuss the definitive phase of CBAM as such during the webinars, and we thank you for your understanding. The transitional phase is a 2-year period during which CBAM will focus on monitoring and reporting. Monitoring because it is a learning phase for all of us, during which we will collect relevant information on the carbon content of the goods that are covered by the CBAM and imported into the EU. This monitoring phase has a twofold objective. First, ensuring a seamless rollout of the CBAM and helping us to best prepare to ensure a smooth kicking of the definitive period as from 1st January 2026. To this end, until 2025, the CBAM will focus on reporting obligations. That means that importers of goods covered by the CBAM and imported into the EU will only have reporting obligations to comply with. They will have to report on the carbon emissions of the goods that they import into the EU and that are covered by the CBAM. And they will have to submit the CBAM reports for each quarter. The CBAM reports will essentially contain the information that you can see on the screen. The total quantity of the goods, of each type of good, expressed in megawatt hours for electricity and in tons for the goods, specified per installation, producing the good and country of origin. The actual total embedded emissions for each good expressed in tons of CO2 emissions per megawatt hours of electricity, or for the other goods in tons of CO2 per emission per ton. The total indirect emissions and the carbon price that has been paid in the country of the production of the goods, if, of course, there is such a carbon price, and also taking into account the relevant rebates or any other forms of compensation. My colleagues Thomas and Ivica will give more explanation on this later in the presentation. Two comments that are very important at this stage already. During the transitional phase, so from October 23 to December 25, there will be no obligation to verify the emissions by accredited verifiers, and there will not be any CBAM financial charge applied on the goods. It is very important, these two fundamental obligations under the CBAM, so the buying and the surrendering of the certificates and the verification, these two fundamental principles of the CBAM will only apply as from 2026 for the definitive period. However, please note that penalties may be imposed on importers by member states, EU member states, national competence authorities for failure to comply with the reporting obligations. For instance, where reporting declarants have not taken any steps to submit their CBAM reports, and higher penalties may be imposed as well where infringements are repeated. As a side note, just for information, the financial adjustment under the CBAM will enter into application as from 2026 with a gradual phase-in over 9 years until 2034. Going back to the presentation. So this slide is about a question that is relevant for the CBAM, of course, and that I think many of you are asking. What emissions are in scope of the CBAM? As a start, there are three categories of emissions, from 1 to 3, and that mirrors the EU ETS. CBAM focuses on direct emissions, which are emissions generated during the production of the goods at the installation level. They also include emissions from the production of heating and cooling, even if that production takes place outside of the installation. Then we have scope 2 emissions, which means the consumption of electricity for the production of the good in scope of the CBAM. During the transitional period, the indirect scope 2 emissions will have to be reported for all the goods in scope of CBAM. Please note that during the definitive period, so as from 2026, for instance, iron and steel and aluminium, under which EU producers, so in the EU, may receive some compensation for the carbon price that they paid. So there will be some differentiations. But for the transitional phase, all indirect scope 2 emissions have to be reported. Finally, we have scope 3 emissions, which mean, for instance, upstream emissions from the CBAM goods that are used as inputs into the production processes of other CBAM goods, which we call complex goods. And my colleagues Thomas and Ivica will come back to this. And these materials are called precursors. Finally, we also have scope 3 emissions for the downstream emissions, such as the consumption, the transportation, the distribution, and these are the blue arrow on the right, and these emissions are not in scope of the CBAM. Emilia, giving you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Maxime, for this introduction. I think it's time then to move to the second part of the webinar, and this will focus on the specifications for aluminium. Ivica, Thomas, it's time for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Camilla. Thank you very much. This section will be most technical one. It's important to give first a more detailed description on the key terms in the CBAM. Firstly, we have aluminium products are considered as a complex goods, as they include embedded emissions from the precursors unwrought aluminium. Further, unwrought aluminium is identified as a simple good in case of raw materials, and fuels used are considered during its manufacture to have a zero embedded emission. Production processes are part of an installation in which chemical or physical processes are carried out to produce goods under an aggregated goods category. In the aluminium sector, that means unwrought aluminium and aluminium products. Unwrought aluminium is produced by several production routes. Primary aluminium for electrolytic smelting, secondary aluminium for melting, recycling of scrap as metal ingots, blocks, billets, slabs, or similar. The aggregated goods category are the groups for which joint production processes are to be defined for the purpose of monitoring. Next slide, please. Here you can see relevant goods in the scope for the CBAM transitional period in the aluminium sector. So as you can see, the aggregated goods categories include both finished aluminium products and precursors, unwrought aluminium. This is consumed in the production of aluminium products. Next slide. Here on this slide, you can see 5 steps to determine embedded emissions. As a first step, declarants need to define installations boundaries, the production processes and routes, which means that you need to identify the good under CBAM scope. The installation need to look as installation vis-a-vis the good that are subject of CBAM, and then defines the installation's boundaries as well as the production processes. As a second step, you need to determine the relevant parameters and select the monitoring method for all the emissions. For the third step, you will need to ensure that further data needed for attribution emissions, that means from heating, cooling, electricity consumption, waste gases, and their respective emissions gases. As a fourth step, you will need to monitor relevant precursor material, imported quantity per installation, specific embedded emissions per ton. In the last step, you will need to determine embedded emissions of CBAM goods per ton, and if needed, you may use preliminary default values. Okay, next slide, please. Here is a presented step 1, defining system boundaries. As an example, from what we can see in the graph, direct emissions can derive from any fossil fuels. Use the drying or preheating of the raw material inputs, from any fuel used by a casting plant, or from processed materials such as from the consumption of electrodes or electrode paste, or from flue gas cleaning. Whereas indirect emissions can derive from the electricity consumed by the process. Also, there are PFCs emissions that must be taken into consideration and which we will elaborate later in this webinar. Next slide, please. Now, we are coming to step 2. In general, it's necessary to monitor direct emissions using methodologies such as standard method, mass balance, or continuous emissions monitoring. If it's relevant, direct emissions include emissions from the production production of heat and waste gases, even if the production takes place outside the installation.
In the context of indirect emissions,
it is necessary to determine
the consumption of electricity
used to produce the CBAM goods and if it's relevant
precursor consumption.
Next slide, please.
We are still in step 2.
Monitoring of direct emissions through
the calculation-based approach uses the quantities of all fuels, relevant materials consumed,
and corresponding calculation factors, in particular so-called
emission factor. The measure-based approach
involves measuring the concentration of the greenhouse gases as well as the flue gases
for each emission source.
As a third part,
it can be used other monitoring system may be elaborated during the introductory period until 31st July 2024.
The operator may apply other methods allowed for emissions monitoring in their jurisdiction if
they lead
to similar
emission coverage
and accuracy. These other methods may include default values made available and published by the European Commission
from the transitional period or any other default values. Continuing with step 2,
monitoring PFC's emissions.
The monitoring covers emissions of 2
perfluorocarbons,
PFCs,
i.e. CF4 and C2F6 resulting from anode effects. Emissions related to anode effects, more precisely high voltage anode effects,
are determined using the slope method of or overvoltage method. Additional PFC emissions are estimated
in accordance with industry
best practices.
In particular,
guidelines provided by the International Aluminium Institute.
Fugitive emissions
are determined by using the collection efficiency
of the duct.
Next slide, please. Continuing with step 2, other methods.
As a part of the flexibility for the reporting, there are additional monitoring reporting methods until
31st December 2024.
As I said, if similar coverage and accuracy of emissions data,
a carbon pricing scheme where the installation is located, or a compulsory emission monitoring scheme where the installation is located,
or emission monitor scheme at the installation, which can include verification by
accredited verifier. Also, there are other reference methods,
including the default values, but with time limit until 31st of July 2024. If the reporting declarant does not have all necessary information. In case of complex goods, including the use of default values, there's an estimation of up to 20% of total embedded emissions, but
without time limitation. Next slide, please.
Now we are moving to step 3. This is probably the most complicated step.
With the formula displayed.
We will explain a few steps. This formula provides a guideline of which parameters need to be monitored.
Whenever an installation has more than one production process, or where heat supply is separated, even or where waste gases or electricity
production are founded in installation.
Second part of this step
is related to attribution of indirect emissions.
For the transitional period of the CBAM,
indirect embedded emissions
must be
reported separately from the direct
embedded emissions for all covered goods. Indirect emissions of an installation or of production processes are equivalent
to the emissions caused by production of electricity
consumed in the installation or production processes of the goods,
respectively multiplied with the applicable emission factor
for electricity. Next slide.
Finally, we are coming to last two steps, 4 and
5. The embedded emission at process level only need to be divided by activity level of the processes in order to arrive at the specific embedded emissions
of the
produced goods. But we need to say that for complex goods,
when calculating specific embedded emissions, it is necessary to take into account the amount
of precursors that were used in the production of the goods and specific embedded emissions of the precursors. Now, my colleague Thomas, in next few slides, will present several case scenarios. Thank you.
Thomas, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Vitsa. Yeah, my task is now to show you a concrete example. Yeah, we have taken an installation that produces first unwrought aluminium via the primary process and produces from that slabs and ingots. The ingots are sold outside, while the slabs in the installations are completely used in subsequent forming steps, for example, rolling, to produce a variety of aluminium products such as wires, plates, sheets, foils. During that forming step, there's also some scrap that unfortunately occurs. That's another output of the installation. So the slide here shows you the step 1 of what Ivica explained. It's the setting of the system boundaries. So here we have an installation that where the production itself has been separated in 2 different production processes. One is for the production of the unwrought aluminium, primary process, and the second one is where the aluminium products are produced. And then what is even wider is that in the installation purchases some of the anodes they use in the production of primary aluminium, but the same installation also produces some of the anodes themselves. That's happening in the installation, but because anode production, and I've seen a question also in the chat, anode production and anodes themselves are not CBAM goods. That's why any emissions that occur from this anode production are outside the scope of CBAM. They are not taken into account. And this installation has then been split up in 2 separate production processes. And this is needed in this case because not all the products from the primary smelting are used then in the same installation to produce aluminium products. Because the ingots are sold, it is necessary to split this installation into 2 separate production processes. If, on the contrary, if all the products of the primary smelting were used to produce the aluminium products, then it would be possible to make a combined production process, we call that the bubble approach, as a means to facilitate the determination of the embedded emissions. So after having set the system boundaries, the next step is identifying the relevant source streams for emissions, and then monitoring them. So on this slide, we'll focus on the source streams that are relevant for direct emissions. On the next slide, we look at the indirect emissions. So in the example, we have consumption of natural gas. Natural gas is used to produce the anodes, but we already said, well, that is outside the scope of the CBAM because the anodes themselves are not CBAM goods. So of course one can monitor it, but it's not strictly necessary to determine the embedded emissions of the CBAM goods. And then the natural gas is used as a heat source for process heating. And the example in this assumption is both in the primary smelting and in the second in the production process 2, where the aluminium products are produced. So you have natural gas that is used in two different production processes. Then in the primary smelting, you have also the direct emissions because of the generation of perfluorinated carbons, and Ivica has explained which are the methodologies that could be used to determine those direct emissions. It's a very specific methodology. And the third important source of direct emissions is the anodes. So the anodes are consumed during the electrolysis. And how is the anode consumption determined? Basically by the mass of the anodes that go into the process and by the remainders of the anodes that go out of it. So the difference is then the anodes consumed. Voila, so we have these are the three streams for production process 1 that are relevant for direct emissions and 1 for the production process 2. Let's have a look at the indirect. Okay, welcome back. So after the last slide on looking at direct emissions, we're on this scheme looking at the electricity consumption and the indirect emissions related to that. That is a bit simpler. While electricity here in this installation is mostly used for 3 purposes. It's again for the anode production, but as already said, that is something happening in installation, but it's not under the scope of CBAM. So can be monitored, the electricity consumption, but not necessarily to determine the embedded indirect emissions of the CBAM goods. Then, of course, the largest consumer of electricity is the electrolysis in the primary smelting process. But then in this example, also some electricity is used for the machinery in the production process too, where then the final aluminium products are produced. Okay, so let's now move to a concrete calculation example on how to determine the embedded emissions. As I said, this installation produces unwrought aluminium. It's these thin goods that are produced and go out of the installation. And then the slabs are taken to produce aluminium goods. So there are basically 2 different specific embedded emissions to be calculated. One is for the unwrought aluminium and the other for the aluminium products. We start with the unwrought aluminium. As explained, there are 3 streams for direct emissions. We have the anode consumption, the electrodes that are consumed during the electrolysis. So basically, what one determines is how much mass of the anodes is consumed by weighing inputs and outputs, and that needs to be multiplied by a certain emission factor. That includes the stoichiometry, but also the carbon content. So here the assumption is purely carbon, and it uses the stoichiometric factor of carbon dioxide and carbon. So multiplying the consumption with this emission factor gives an amount of emissions. Here it's 252,860. Then in this production process 1 for the electrolysis, we also had some natural gas consumption. Same or very similar calculation. One takes the consumption of the natural gas and multiplies this, in this case, with an emission factor and the net calorific value. So from the consumption of the gas, we get to a figure for the emissions. And the last entry here is the direct emissions due to the generation of perfluorocarbons. There's very specific methodologies that need to be applied to come to that figure. And there, in this example, we had 25,000 tons of CO2 emissions. So summing up these 3 different store streams gives the total emissions 311,000. So for the direct emissions for the process 2, it's a bit easier. We only had the consumption of natural gas. We apply the same as before, multiplying with the net calorific value and with the emission factor. And then from the gas consumption, we get to the emissions. So that's already then the final result for process 2. And when one sums up the figures, then one can also calculate the total direct emissions of the installation. Okay. Next slide for the indirect emissions. Well, as I said, what needs to be monitored is the consumption of electricity. in megawatt hours, and then that figure is multiplied with an emission factor. By default in CBAM, the registry will provide country-specific emission factors. They are based on IEA data and depend a lot on the electricity mix that is used in the country. There are possibilities also to use actual emission factors under certain conditions. If there's a direct technical link or a power purchase agreement. Okay, in this case, we have just put here a figure. The emissions are then calculated by multiplying the electricity with the emission factor, and then one gets the indirect emissions, both again for process 1 and process 2. And when one sums up these emissions, then one gets also the total indirect emissions. So the final step in the calculation now, and that is an example for the steps 4 and 5 that Ivica has explained before in the scheme, is how to calculate the specific embedded emissions. And as I said, we have to distinguish between the two products. These unwrought aluminium, these are the ingots and slabs that are produced, and then the final aluminium products. For the ingots and slabs is very easy. One just needs to sum up all of the products. The mass here in the example is 200,000, and take the direct and indirect emissions, the figures for the process step number 1, and by dividing each of those emission figures with the total amount of goods produced, one gets the specific embedded emissions, both for direct and for indirect. So 1.555 for the direct in this case, and 6.150. Now for the aluminium products, so the process 2, it's slightly more complicated, because now we have to take into account the emissions basically that are caused by the process 2, but also the emissions that are like carried over, or we say embedded in the precursor, which is the slabs. We take for the slabs the values that we have just calculated before, but we have to consider that not the slabs are not completely converted. If you remember on the very first slide, there was a small, a stream going out, and that's the scrap. So there is some manufacturing ongoing, but not the whole aluminium is the whole input unwrought aluminium is converted into product. So that's one would have to make like the ratio between what comes in the mass and what comes out of the product, and that's this factor of 1.062. So for the contribution of the precursor slabs, one takes the value then specific embedded emissions calculated for the unwrought aluminium and multiplies that with this factor. And then one gets this 1.651 and 6.531. And to that specific embedded emissions, one needs to add the contribution of emissions, direct emissions that happen in the process 2 because of the natural gas consumption or the electricity consumption. So one would take the direct emissions that were calculated previously, and divide that by the amount of aluminium products that is produced. Gets two other figures, and then summing up the things gives the final specific embedded emissions for aluminium products, direct and indirect. So you see the figures are similar, but because there's some additional processing happening, the aluminium products naturally have a slightly higher embedded emissions than the unwrought aluminium. This example is taken from our guidance document. We can only invite you to have a closer look, maybe take a calculator and try to reproduce the figures. I think that's very instructive to understand the whole methodology. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much to the both of you. I think then it's time to move on to the third part of the webinar. Sorry for that delay, and we're back again for the third part. I see that there is already a lot of questions in the chat, and some of them are on how to report and what to report. Luckily, Maxime will explain a bit the concept of the reporting obligations for both the importers and the indirect representatives, and how the administration will function during the transitional period. Maxime, the floor is yours once again.
Thank you. Overview of the different actors in the CBAM field. So if we start from, of course, the operators of installation, mainly a few highlights on each of the roles. Operators will have to provide the reporting declarants with the information, the relevant information for the reporting declarants to submit their CBAM report to comply with the reporting obligations. At EU member states level, the national competent authorities that you can see on the bottom, the lower part of the slide, will be in charge of ensuring compliance with the CBAM related obligations in their territory, and the custom authorities. And lastly, the European Commission will be in charge of all of the monitoring and the reviewing of the implementation of the CBAM during the transitional period. Beyond these key highlights on the role of each of these actors, what this slide shows is that CBAM, the effective implementation of the CBAM, will require some regular dialogue and communication between the various actors. For instance, like I said, between the operators of installation and the reporting declarants. That is a key aspect that on which a lot of questions are focused. This is very important indeed, that operators of installation, with the explanations that my colleagues Ivica and Thomas have explained, provide with the information that is relevant to comply with the reporting obligations, so that the reporting declarant, we will see after what this means, can comply with the reporting obligation. And that's very important. And there will also be some dialogue and exchanges between the various institutions at member states level, EU member states level, like I said, but also with the Commission. Moving to the next slide. So this slide focuses on the importers. Because we usually use the word importers, but the EU regulation, the implementing regulation, refers to reporting declarants. So this slide is about the difference between importers and reporting declarants. During the transitional period, for CBAM purposes, the reporting declarant is responsible for the reporting and therefore must comply with the reporting obligations under CBAM on a quarterly basis, like we explained before. The reporting on the embedded emission of the good that they import for each quarter. There are different situations in which reporting declarants are not necessarily the importers. So first, the question that you must ask is the importer based in the EU? If the importer is based in the EU, then there is a choice for the importer to make. Either the importer chooses to be the reporting declarant for CBAM purposes, or the importer can appoint a customs representative. If the importer is based in the EU, again, the importer is the person liable to CBAM-related obligations, unless the importer chooses an indirect customs representative who, in turn, will bear the CBAM-related reporting obligations. In that case, the indirect customs representative must agree with that responsibility. In any case, this is very, very important to stress that the reporting declarant can never be the direct customs representative. Then, second possibility, the importer is not based in the EU. In that particular situation, there is no choice to make. The importer must appoint an indirect customs representative who will bear the CBAM-related obligations. Finally, just a comment on the definitive period. There will be a specific authorization procedure for member states' national competent authorities to grant the CBAM authorized declaring status, but not for the transitional period. Next slide, please. Yes. This slide is about the question that importers, well, the reporting declarants, must take to comply with the CBAM rules. The first question that you have to ask is whether you are impacted by the CBAM. Are you an importer of CBAM goods? The first thing to do for you to determine if you are impacted by the CBAM is to check the CN codes of the goods that you import into the EU against and compare against the Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation from May 2023. Then you will know whether you import goods that are covered by the CBAM into the EU. As a second step, you will have to align with the reporting period that has been chosen by the operator of the installation located in a non-EU country producing the CBAM goods. By default, the calendar year is suggested. However, there are other possibilities. If the installation located in a non-EU member state is located in a country which has a different calendar, or whether there are some reasonable justifications for using a different period, then this is possible, provided, however, that that alternative period covers at least 3 months. As a third, and this is a question that we see in the chat about the reporting period in countries which use different calendars. As a third step, you must be aware of all the parameters that have been chosen by the operators of the installation producing the good when monitoring and collecting the data, the relevant data on the CBAM goods. And as Ivica and Thomas explained earlier, there are some choices to make regarding the approaches, the possible approaches to calculate the embedded emissions of the good. What are the direct emissions? Which methodology has been chosen, etc. There are some questions of installation who will provide you with that information. Then you will be able to define, step 5, to collect the data on the carbon price that has been paid in the jurisdiction where the goods were produced, if there is such a carbon pricing scheme in that country. That carbon price will be able to take into account the possible compensations or rebates if there is such, if there are some. This is very important already in the step of at this stage, because even though there is no financial obligation under the CBAM, as you know now, it will only apply as from 2026. Yes, but it is very important for us to gain knowledge and to get this information already during the transitional phase, so that we ensure that by the end of the transitional period, we are prepared to take this different carbon price paid into account as from 2026. As you acknowledge, given all the presentations that you have had so far, complying with all these steps and taking all these steps actually require regular cooperation and communication between the various actors and, of course, the operators of installation and the importers. To facilitate this communication, especially between the operator of installation and the reporting declarants, we have developed 2 tools. First, there's a framework which summarizes the information to be reported. You may find this framework in Annex 4 of the 2017 August 2023 implementing regulation. This framework is called Recommended Communication from Operators of Installation to Reporting Declarants. And you will also find a second tool, which is a communication template, which may serve as a basis for importers to gather data, the relevant data that they need to comply with the the CBAM related obligations from the operators of installation. And this template is made available on the CBAM dedicated webpage of the European Commission. These two tools obviously are not like mandatory for you to use. They are here to help you, but we can only encourage you to make the best use of them because it can also serve some purpose in some situations, for instance, where importers import CBAM goods from different installations, possibly located in different countries with different languages, or a different situation where one operator of installation exports goods into the EU via multiple importers. In that case, a single data collection process can really make your life easier. Despite all this, in cases where the information to be reported by reporting declarants is not available at the time when the CBAM goods are being imported into the EU, then reporting declarants will have the possibility to use default values on CO2 emissions for each CBAM good that they import into the EU until 31st of July 2024. Also, another comment, the production site, so the installation producing the goods outside the EU, will also have the possibility soon to register in the EU central base to communicate the emission reports, and that will facilitate the compliance for the CBAM purposes, but it will only be possible at a later stage as from 2025. Thank you, Camilla. Then moving to the submission of the CBAM report. On the next slide, you will see a snapshot of how the reporting obligations will take place in practice. I think it's very important to highlight that there will be a CBAM transitional registry to fulfill this obligation. This will be a standardized and secured electronic database developed and managed by the European Commission to ensure an efficient implementation of the reporting obligations during the transitional period. It will also collect the information reported during that period. You have a lot of questions on that transitional registry. It is under development. This is the final phase of the development, and the register will be deployed by the end of the month. It will be up and running no later than 1st of October, so that all of you can fulfill the obligations on time. Note that this transitional registry will also be used for communication purposes, between national competent authorities and to some extent also the custom authorities. And that's what you can see on the screen. All the steps for the reporting declarants to fulfill their CBAM related obligations can be performed on the transitional registry. They will be able to upload information. They will be able also to retrieve information that has been stored in the database. Some information will already be pre-filled, thanks to the information that they will have stored already. All the communication also will take place via these transitional registries. There are a few exceptions, though, that I would like to mention. The communication between the reporting declarants and the custom authorities may take place outside the transitional registry. For instance, during the transitional period, the member states' custom authorities will have the task to inform the importers of their obligations in relation to the CBAM that may take place outside the transitional registry. Another important point is that, like I said, operators of installation will be able at a later stage to save and record some information on their installations. This is the arrow that you can see on the bottom left of the screen. That will take place at a later stage. Very important to stress that in no circumstances the information that is stored and accessible on this transitional registry will be made public. The information can only be accessed by the person in charge that have been cleared and are in charge of the information that they can upload, manage, edit, save, or delete. That registry will not be used for enforcement, as the information collected will only serve to feed the assessment process of the Commission during the transitional phase. And of course, it will be the basis for the development of the registry will serve during will be in place as from the 2026 on the definitive period. Then moving to the transitional registry itself, once main web page, and as you can see on the screen, with all the boxes, you will have access to all the functionalities of the transitional registries. Via these different boxes, you will be able to record, to save, to edit, to amend, and to delete also all the information that is necessary for you to manage in order to submit the CBAM reports. And of course, this is where also reporting the clients will submit their CBAM reports. They will be able to navigate in these different boxes, and by clicking on each of these boxes and navigate, you will find all the relevant information for you to use. In the quarterly reports, you will find the CBAM reports that is that is covering the current reporting period, but also the previous CBAM reports. In the box on installation, you will find all the information that has been stored regarding the installation that are linked with your account. Same for the operators of installations, and same also for my importers, because as you can see, as we saw already, reporting declarants are not necessarily the importers. And in my profile information, of course, you will be able to manage the information in relation to your account. Moving to the next slide on the timelines. On this screen, you will see the timelines applied on each of the reporting period during the transitional phase. As you can see, for the first two lines, which are the first two reporting periods, there will be some flexibilities, meaning that for these two CBAM reports, there will be a later deadline for the modification, the possible modification, if needed, of the CBAM reports. After that period, the CBAM reports will have to be submitted by reporting declarants by the end of the months following the review, the reporting period, and can be modified up to 2 months after this review period. During the definitive phase, just a word on that, the reporting period will change, and we will move from quarters to annual basis, and the CBAM declarations will have to be submitted on an annual basis. And this is it from my side. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Maxime. I think now we will take a little break of 2 minutes because we need to compile some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, and we will get back to you. I can already now say that I think we have had a bit of technical issues, so we will extend the Q&A with additional 10 minutes for you. So please go grab a quick coffee and we will be right back. Thank you. Perfect, and welcome back. I hope you had the chance to grab a coffee or something to drink. Just to summarize some of the questions, there are quite a few questions that relate to the definitive period. That includes, for example, the accreditation of verifiers, how to use the 80% rules, the surrender of certificates. Those questions will not be answered during this Q&A as it's for the definitive phase. As you will also see in the CBAM regulation itself, the Commission has quite a few empowerments, and those are some that we are already now working on. So some of the questions we are not even able to answer at the moment as we speak. I think I will start by giving the floor to my colleague Thomas, who will address some of the questions raised on the use of default values.
Yes, thank you, Camilla. So let's start first with a clarification. We are currently speaking of default values to be used for the reporting in the transitional period. So what we intend to publish very soon. So the aim is to publish them by end of September, to be make them available on the CBAM website and also in the CBAM registry so that they can be used automatically. These default values are only for the transitional period until the end of 2025. Starting in 2026, there will be different default values. And there will be a specific implementing legislation, a specific implementing act. It needs to be adopted that also will set some markup. So these are the values that only are to be used until 2025. And there are certain conditions under which they can be used. There is the possibility as a time-limited derogation that they can be used for reporting, and a possibility that is not limited in time, but in terms of quantity or extent to which they can be used. So the time-limited derogation is that default values can be used for reporting for the first 3 quarters, so until end of June 2024. Default values are provided both for direct and for indirect emissions and for all goods with their CN codes. There will be just one value per CN code, which represents something like a world average. There's therefore no distinction between the country. So this is the derogation that's possible, or this reporting using default value that's possible until end of June. Then there's also the possibility to use estimations of embedded emissions. However, there's a limitation to the extent to which they can be used, and such estimations cannot be used to estimate more than 20% of the overall embedded emissions of a good. A typical example is that maybe you have a manufacturer of a CBAM good that takes raw steel or aluminium sheets and then does some cutting out of it to produce smaller parts in specific shapes. Usually that installation will have an overall relatively minor contribution to the embedded emissions, because most of the emissions happen before and in the primary, for example, in the primary aluminium production. So in that case, that installation could estimate its contribution to the overall, but still would need the data from the supplier of the unwrought aluminium. So this estimation possibility, this possibility to use estimation includes the use of default values. Again, that's without time limit. So, and what I've seen in a number of questions, what do we do from July 2024 onwards? Well, that's the point where, after this 9 months temporary derogation, importers need to be well cooperating with their producers to get those figures for the CBAM reporting.
Nice. Also in the chat, there has been quite a lot of comments or questions on the customs-related issues. Luckily for us today, our Deputy Head of Unit, David Boubil, has also joined us, and he will answer a few of the questions related to customs.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there were a number of questions on goods entering the EU under customs suspensive regime, such as inward processing, but also temporary admission, etc. CBAM is a measure that applies when goods are put into free circulation, meaning that if they enter the EU under any other customs regime, either to be transformed, or because they are packaging destined to go back, or because they come from, let's say, for an exhibition. In that case, CBAM does not apply. CBAM applies only to goods that are put into free circulation in the EU. There were also questions about, importing goods that are provided free of charge. Well, it's not the commercial transaction that triggers CBAM, it's the entering into the EU. So if goods are brought into the EU, and if they're above the de minimis value of 150 euros and they're CBAM goods, in that case, CBAM will apply. There were questions about rules of origin. Well, the regulation is clear that the origin that determines whether CBAM applies or not, and that is particularly relevant for goods coming from EEA countries and Switzerland, are the rules for non-preferential origin. I've seen comments from businesses saying that they were more used to preferential origin. Yes, that may be the case, but the non-preferential origin is also a competency field in the customs declaration, and this is the origin that matters to determine whether the CBAM applies or not. And yes, so these were the questions. Wait. There were a few more questions on customs. No, I think these were the questions on customs, but I'll continue looking at those arriving.
And Maxime, he would like to follow up on some answers to questions related to the reporting itself.
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. There are some questions about the reporting timelines and also the reporting periods and the possible consequences in case of failure with the reporting obligations. Like I said, by default, the calendar year is used. However, in the conditions that I explained, it is possible to choose alternative periods. So it is a choice for the importers and the operators of installation to make. There's also a question on the need on how many CBAM reports have to be submitted. There is only one CBAM report per reporting period. That CBAM report must contain information on each type of goods, of CBAM goods, also taking into consideration the various parameters that we explained, and also the aggregated goods category, and specifying also the installation producing the good. However, if the goods are imported into the EU via different member states, there is not one CBAM report per member states of importation. There is only one CBAM report. And I think for the reporting obligation, for the timeline and the reporting obligation, and for the penalties, the transitional period, like we said, is a phase during which we will all learn from the CBAM. There will not be specific reviews from the national competent authorities of each CBAM reports regarding the information on carbon content of the goods. There is not on-site visit. So my point is to say that the review of the implementation of the CBAM will take place at an overall level. The penalties will be applied in cases of failure to comply with the reporting obligations. That is very important to stress. And in cases there are some difficulties in the dialogue between the operators of installations and the reporting declarants, then there's still the possibility for reporting declarants to use the default value as we explained at several occasions during the webinar. So I think it's very important to stress that. And I think that's okay for the reporting obligations.
I think that Thomas has some additional questions that he would like to address.
Yes, I've seen a number of questions on, yeah, I try to group them a bit. There are a number of questions referring to what happens if a good is actually a mixture of different materials, for example, contains steel and aluminium, or what happens if under the same CN code there are a lot of different qualities of that aluminium. So how should the reporting take place in that case? I mean, first question, I mean, in case of whatever mixed materials or if they are alloys, what really matters first is what is the CN code of the good? And first, that would then be the decision. I mean, that CN code, is it a good that falls under CBAM or not? If it falls under CBAM, one then would check in the implementing regulation and also in the CBAM regulation is under which sector it falls. And in the implementing regulation, then there are more specific rules on reporting and determining embedded emissions. I mean, I don't know, I just inventing an example, maybe you have 50% steel and iron and 50% aluminium. Okay, you would have to check this with the CN code under which category it falls and then apply by the rules. If under the same CN code, there are very different qualities, aluminium or steel qualities, and of course they could have very different embedded emissions, then the reporting would have to make some averaging over the production, because basically the transitional CBAM registry reporting of embedded emissions is by CN code. There's no further differentiation at this stage. We will evaluate the data and maybe in the future, if we see there's a need, it could maybe come. Then I saw a number of questions relating to the methodology of determining emissions on scope 1, scope 2, and 3. As a general remark, the CBAM methodology differs from other greenhouse gas reporting, and most widely used is this greenhouse gas protocol. Why is that? The CBAM methodology tries to mirror as much as possible the methodology that is used in the EU's emissions trading system. This is because in the end, when CBAM fully applies, there will be a CBAM obligation to be paid at the border. And to calculate that obligation correctly, one would needs to use the same methodology, because otherwise it could mean that the importer pays more than the EU producer, or it could mean that the importer pays less. And the aim of CBAM is that EU producers and importers are put on the same level playing field to avoid carbon leakage. And this explains why some things are different. I've seen one question, why are you referring to scope 1, or 2, or 3 on the slide? That slide was supposed to illustrate a bit the difference between the methodology used under CBAM and the methodology that is used in this greenhouse gas protocol. So under scope 1, we have the direct emissions, that is like in the greenhouse gas protocol, but under CBAM we also take into account the steam, if the emissions related to steam that is purchased from another installation. So they would be attributed to the directly attributable emissions, and that is the long formula, this long sum that Ivica showed in his part of the presentation. So that is a difference. Another difference is that in CBAM we include the embedded emissions of relevant precursors, and that is in the greenhouse protocols typically scope 3 emissions. But these are raw materials, but we only take raw materials that themselves are also CBAM goods. those embedded emissions are included in the calculation of the final embedded emissions of the product.
Thank you very much, Thomas. David, have you looked like you had some additional questions? No?
There's something, if I may.
And I think we now will address some questions related to the template.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. There's a few questions regarding template. First one is, does the CBAM communication template distinguish between our wrought aluminium and the semi-final aluminium products? The simple answer, yes, it is distinguishing the processes. So answer is positive. A second question, with respect to the first report that will be due in January 2024, should the foregoing installations consider the data for the full year 2023? By default, the reference period for the reporting in 1 year. That's the answer. Third question, is the Commission going to determine CO2 values to attribution to pre-consumer scrap, and how one would be assured that each value are reported? Scrap is currently outside of the CBAM scope, but therefore no need to determine default values in this sense. Okay, other questions already answered by Thomas. So that's all from this. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe just a few more questions on customs that I've seen, even if there were points that were made in the presentation, which is who should declare, who should report the emissions for CBAM. And some questions were relating these to the Incoterms. The point there is who declares the import to customs. And in most cases, it will be the declarant in the customs declaration that declares also for CBAM. In some cases, in some cases, it may be the person indicated as importer in the declaration. No need to go in more detail on this one. On the question of return goods are not in the scope of CBAM. So CBAM would not apply to return goods. That's it.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I think I will sum up where you can find further information on CBAM. What I would recommend to you is to visit the CBAM webpage regularly. There you will find the 2 guidance documents that we have produced. You will also find the communication template between the importers and the operators. There is the registration to the dedicated webinars, and there you will also find the registration for the webinars on how to use the CBAM transitional registry. Those webinars, those dates for those webinars are to come. On that webpage, you will also find the link to our e-learning materials through the Customs and Tax EU Learning Portal. On the webpage, you will also find the Q&A and fact sheets. And soon there will also be the links to the recorded webinars. And let me just say that we will continue to provide with updates for our Q&A, for our guidance documents and so on, as that we also get smarter and more and dedicated questions that we answer. So information will be provided throughout this period for all of us. I would like to thank you for participating today, and I hope I will see you in another webinar.